Sarah Martinez was invisible at the shooting range, just another part-timer changing targets while studying nursing. Until a Navy SEAL's frustrated cursing shattered the morning quiet, blaming his rifle for missed shots. She'd watched him for 30 minutes, knowing exactly what he was doing wrong. Then she spoke up. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The desert sun cut sharp angles across the shooting range at 0800, casting long shadows between the concrete barriers. Sarah Martinez moved through them like she belonged to the silence itself, unhurried, purposeful, her work boots leaving perfect prints in the sand between the firing positions. She carried the morning's first batch of paper targets under one arm, a small toolbox in the other hand, her movements economical in the way of someone who'd learned that wasted motion was wasted time. At 22, Sarah had the kind of quiet presence that made people forget she was there until they needed something fixed. She'd been working part-time at Coronado Range for 8 months now, fitting her shifts around nursing school classes and clinical rotations. The pay wasn't much, but it covered her textbooks and kept gas in her beat-up Honda Civic. More than that, though, the range felt like home in a way the hospital corridors never quite did. She clipped a fresh target to the 500-yard frame, the paper snapping taut in the morning breeze that carried the salt tang of the Pacific just beyond the hills. Through her safety glasses, she watched a red-tailed hawk circle overhead, riding the thermals with the same patience her father had tried to teach her all those years ago. Marksmanship isn't about the gun, Mija, Staff Sergeant Martinez had told her when she was 12, adjusting her grip on his old Remington 700. It's about becoming still enough to let the shot happen. The memories surfaced without warning, the way they often did when she was alone on the range. Her father's calloused hands guiding hers, his voice steady and unhurried, never pushing, always teaching. He'd been dead 3 years now, cancer, not combat, but his lessons lived in her muscle memory, in the way she breathed, in how she read wind and distance without thinking about it. Sarah secured the last target and started the long walk back to the firing line, her radio crackling with the rangemaster's voice. Hot range in 15. Special Operations Group inbound. She nodded to herself, quickening her pace slightly. SEALs meant precision shooters, which meant less cleanup afterward but higher standards for everything. She'd worked their sessions before, they were professional, focused, and they tipped well. They also had a way of testing the staff that wasn't quite hazing but wasn't entirely friendly either. The black Suburbans rolled through the gate at exactly 0815, kicking up dust clouds that hung in the still air. Sarah was restocking ammunition when she heard the doors slam, followed by the familiar sound of gear being unloaded, hard cases hitting concrete, the metallic click of rifle bolts being checked, the low murmur of men preparing for serious work. She glanced up from her inventory sheet as 8 operators moved through the gate in desert camouflage, their movements fluid despite the weight of equipment. Most carried their own rifles, but she noticed the range's loaner weapons being distributed to a few of the newer faces. That usually meant fresh graduates from BUD/S, still earning their place in the teams. Martinez, right? Sarah looked up to find a man in his 40s approaching, Master Chief's anchors barely visible beneath the grime on his collar. Jake Sullivan, she'd seen him before, though they'd never spoken directly. He had the kind of weathered face that spoke of years and places that didn't appear on most maps, but his eyes were sharp and assessing rather than hard. Yes, sir. She kept her voice level, professional. We'll be working positions 1 through 8 today. Long-range precision, multiple distances. Can you handle target changes on the fly? Of course. He studied her for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded. Good. We've got some fresh blood today, might need patience with the equipment adjustments. Sarah almost smiled at that. Equipment adjustments. It was always the equipment. The morning progressed in the familiar rhythm of professional training. Commands echoed across the range in clipped, efficient tones. Brass casings clinked against concrete. The distinctive crack of .308 rounds split the air at irregular intervals, each shot followed by spotting calls and quiet consultations over wind readings. Sarah moved between the positions, refilling ammunition, adjusting targets, staying invisible in the way that good range staff learned to perfect. She watched without seeming to watch, learning the shooter's habits, their strengths and weaknesses. The veteran operators moved through their drills with mechanical precision, their shots clustering tight even at extended distances. But Position 6 was struggling. Rodriguez, she'd caught his name during the morning briefing, was maybe 25, with the kind of eager intensity that hadn't yet been tempered by experience. He'd been working the same 600-yard target for 30 minutes, and his frustration was starting to show in the set of his shoulders, the way he jerked the bolt action just a fraction too aggressively. Sarah was replacing targets at the 300-yard line when she heard him curse loudly enough to carry across the range. "This rifle's fucked," Rodriguez announced, his voice tight with frustration. "Scopes off, triggers mushy as hell. How are we supposed to maintain standards with substandard equipment?" The range went quiet except for the wind whistling through the target frames. Sarah finished clipping the fresh paper to the frame, taking her time, but she could feel the tension building behind her like pressure before a storm. "Maybe it's not the rifle," someone suggested, though she couldn't see who from her position. "Easy for you to say, Walsh. You got one of the good ones." Sarah turned and started walking back toward the firing line, passing close enough to position 6 to see Rodriguez's target through her binoculars. The shots were scattered across the upper right quadrant of the paper, consistent in their inconsistency, which told her everything she needed to know. She'd seen this exact pattern hundreds of times. Her father had diagnosed it in her own shooting when she was 15, spending an entire afternoon breaking down her form until she understood where the problem lived. Rodriguez was still complaining when she reached the equipment shed, his voice carrying across the range as he gestured at the rifle like it had personally betrayed him. The other operators had stopped their own drills to watch, some with barely concealed irritation, others with the patient resignation of men who'd seen this movie before. "I'm telling you, Chief, this thing's zeroed wrong. Look at this grouping." Rodriguez held up his target, the shots scattered like buckshot. Sarah found herself speaking before she'd consciously decided to. "It's not the zero." The words cut through the morning air with unexpected clarity. 8 faces turned toward her, expressions ranging from surprise to outright skepticism. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "Your shots are consistently high and right," she continued, walking closer but keeping her hands visible and non-threatening. "That's not a mechanical issue." Rodriguez's expression darkened. "What did you say?" "The pattern suggests you're canting the rifle and pulling your shots," Sarah said, her father's voice echoing in her memory. "Tell them what you see, Mija. Don't apologize for seeing clearly. Your breathing's off too, you're taking the shot on the inhale instead of the natural respiratory pause." The silence stretched long enough to feel dangerous. Sarah could see Rodriguez's jaw working, could practically feel the heat of his anger. But she'd committed now, and something in her father's training wouldn't let her back down from the truth. "You think you know better than a Navy SEAL?" Rodriguez's voice carried an edge that made Sarah's instincts sharpen, but she didn't step back. "I think I know what I'm looking at," she said simply. Chief Sullivan's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Show me." All eyes turned to him. He was standing with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You want to make the diagnosis, Martinez? Then you can demonstrate the cure." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't how she'd imagined the morning going when she'd clocked in at 0700. But Sullivan was already gesturing toward Rodriguez's rifle, and there was no polite way to decline a challenge from a Master Chief. "I don't want to." "I'm not asking what you want," Sullivan said, though his tone wasn't unkind. "I'm asking what you can do." Rodriguez was staring at her with undisguised hostility, but he stepped back from the firing position, gesturing toward the rifle with exaggerated courtesy. "Be my guest, expert." Sarah approached the bench slowly, hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. The rifle was a Remington 700 Police, similar to the one her father had taught her on but newer, with a more advanced scope. She lifted it carefully, feeling the weight distribution, the balance point. The first thing she noticed was the slight looseness in the bipod legs, not enough to affect accuracy significantly, but enough to introduce inconsistency if the shooter was muscling the rifle instead of letting it settle naturally. She adjusted the legs with small, precise movements, then settled behind the weapon. Through the scope, the 600-yard target looked impossibly small, wavering slightly in the heat mirage rising from the desert floor. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting her father's training flow through her like water finding its level. "Don't aim the rifle, Mija. Point it where you want the bullet to go, then become still enough to let the shot break itself." She opened her eyes and acquired the target, feeling the familiar sensation of the world narrowing to this single point of focus. Her breathing deepened, slowed, found its natural rhythm. On the exhale, she let her body settle into the rifle, feeling the stock meet her shoulder with perfect consistency. The crosshairs drifted with her breathing, rising and falling in small, predictable movements. Sarah waited, patient as stone, for the moment between heartbeats when everything aligned. The rifle jumped against her shoulder with a sharp crack that seemed to split the morning in half. Through the scope, she watched the spotting scope operator call the hit. Dead center. Sarah worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round. The second shot followed 10 seconds later, then the third. Each one found the center of the target with mechanical precision, the kind of grouping that spoke of years of disciplined practice. She safed the rifle and stepped back, her hands trembling slightly from adrenaline she hadn't expected to feel. The range was utterly silent except for the wind through the target frames and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. Rodriguez was staring at the target through binoculars, his expression shifting from disbelief to something that might have been embarrassment. The other operators were studying her with new interest, the kind of frank assessment that came after assumptions had been shattered. Chief Sullivan walked to the spotting scope and took a long look down range. When he straightened, his expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah caught something that might have been approval in his eyes. 3 shots, sub-MOA grouping at 600 yards, he announced to the group. Using the same rifle Rodriguez claimed was malfunctioning. The silence stretched another heartbeat, then Rodriguez cleared his throat. What was I doing wrong? Sarah looked at him, seeing past the wounded pride to genuine curiosity. You were fighting the rifle instead of working with it. Your grip was too tight and you were trying to force precision instead of letting it happen naturally. She gestured toward the bench. May I? Rodriguez nodded, and Sarah moved back to the firing position, though she didn't take up the rifle. Instead, she demonstrated the shooting position with empty hands, showing him how to align his body, where to place his support hand, how to let the rifle settle into its natural point of aim. The shot breaks when everything aligns, she explained, echoing her father's words from years of patient instruction. But you can't force that alignment. You have to create the conditions and then wait for it to happen. For the next hour, Sarah worked with Rodriguez while the other operators continued their training. She showed him how to read his natural respiratory cycle, how to manage recoil anticipation, how to call his shots based on sight picture and follow-through. Her voice stayed quiet, almost conversational, but her demonstrations were flawless. By the time they broke for lunch, Rodriguez was consistently hitting the center ring at 600 yards. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Chief Sullivan asked as Sarah was collecting the morning's brass. The other operators had moved to the shade near their vehicles, but he'd lingered, watching her work with the same careful attention he'd shown her shooting. My father, Sarah said, straightening with a plastic bag full of spent casings. He was a Marine Scout sniper. Started teaching me when I was old enough to hold a rifle steady. Sullivan nodded slowly. Active duty? Retired staff sergeant. He passed 3 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss. The words carried genuine weight, the kind of condolence that came from understanding what that loss meant. He taught you well. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. He was a good teacher. Patient. That kind of skill doesn't come from just good teaching, Sullivan said. It takes dedication. Discipline. How often do you shoot? Not as much as I used to, Sarah admitted. Nursing school keeps me pretty busy. Sullivan was quiet for a moment, studying her with the same intensity he might bring to a tactical problem. We run precision marksmanship courses for civilian contractors and Allied Forces personnel. Advanced stuff, ballistics, environmental factors, long-range techniques. The pay's decent and it's mostly weekends. Sarah looked up from the brass she was sorting, not sure she'd heard correctly. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity, Sullivan corrected. If you're interested in putting those skills to work for something more than target changes and ammunition counts. The afternoon training session went differently than the morning. Rodriguez approached his shots with new patience, implementing the technique Sarah had shown him with increasing success. But more than that, the other operators had begun to include her in their conversations, asking her opinion on wind calls and equipment preferences with the kind of respect usually reserved for peers. Sarah found herself thinking about her father as she watched them work. He'd always believed that skill should speak for itself, that competence earned its own authority regardless of where it came from. She'd never expected to test that philosophy in a place like this, with people like these. When the session ended and the SEALs were packing their gear, Rodriguez approached her one last time. Thank you, he said, offering his hand. I was being an ass earlier. You could have let me keep failing, but you didn't. Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip, the direct eye contact. We all need help sometimes. You're shooting solid now, just remember to trust the process. As the Suburbans pulled away in another cloud of dust, Sarah began her end-of-day cleanup routine. The range felt different somehow, charged with possibilities she hadn't considered when she'd clocked in that morning. Chief Sullivan had left his card tucked under the windshield wiper of her Honda. No message, just his contact information and the simple instruction, "Call when you're ready." Sarah held the card up to the setting sun, thinking about the path that had brought her here. Nursing school had always been the plan, a stable career, good money, the chance to help people. It was practical, responsible, everything her father had raised her to value. But there was another kind of helping, wasn't there? Another way to serve, to teach, to pass on the lessons that had shaped her into who she was. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment with her nursing textbooks spread across the kitchen table, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the range. To the feel of the rifle settling into her shoulder, the satisfaction of a perfect shot, the way Rodriguez's face had changed when he finally understood what she was trying to teach him. She picked up her phone and scrolled to Sullivan's contact information. Not to call, not yet, but to remind herself that the option existed. Outside her window, the sun was setting over the hills that separated her from the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in those hills, targets were waiting for tomorrow's shooters, and Sarah would be there to change them, to maintain them, to ensure they were ready. But maybe, just maybe, she would be ready for something more. The card lay on her textbook like a bridge between two possible futures. Sarah touched it once, lightly, then returned to her studies. Some decisions couldn't be rushed, and her father had taught her the value of patience above all else. The shot would break when everything aligned. Until then she would wait and she would be ready.